gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we're ready to go, and we're going to start by with me asking John some questions about the national and state picture, and then I'm going to do my shtick, which is a PowerPoint for like 15 minutes. So that's how we're going to divide the time. I want to start with, the big question, of course, today is we have this government shutdown. When does it end, and what does it look like when it ends?
Sure. Thanks, Rob, and thank you to the Chamber for the introduction. This is one of my favorite speaking engagements all year, in large part because I get to leave Washington, D.C. and come to a real hockey town.
Kissing up to the fans.
And so the shutdown is obviously something that's affecting my hometown in a very serious way, but it's affecting communities across the United States in ways that I think the media and particularly elected officials are not sensitive enough to. In terms of when the shutdown will end, that's anybody's guess. I got out of the prediction business after 2016, and I'm not going to make a prediction on this. What I will say is it's unlikely to end this week. If there is going to be some hope, it's going to involve some internal negotiations between the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, and perhaps the President along the way. But I do think that that's actually not a crack at the President, but I do think that the President is going to take his cues from Majority Leader McConnell. What deal ends up ending the shutdown is likely going to involve significant reforms to immigration. The president has suggested that he is open to that. The Democrats are obviously starting to put together some legislative language that would fund border security, similar to the amount that the president is interested in, but also finding things like a permanent fix for DACA and a permanent fix for some refugees who are here in the United States as well. This is important. This is something that Democrats and a lot of Republicans have wanted to fix for quite some time, and it turns out that this is the moment where there's a master deal maker and a master negotiator at the table, and her name's Nancy Pelosi. And she's going to really lead this effort in a way that will be able to extract the kinds of concessions from the White House that speakers in the past, and including Democratic leaders in the past, were just unable to get done. Like I said, when that happens, who knows? But it looks like there is some light at the end of the tunnel, more so than we had at the beginning of the week, and certainly more so than we had over 30 days ago when this shutdown began.
So based on the last election, the state election, and of course the national elections, is Nevada a blue state now?
No, I don't think Nevada is a blue state. I think there is a lot of evidence that would suggest that Democrats can do extraordinarily well in this state. Almost all of the constitutional offices obviously went to Democrats, a supermajority in one chamber of the state legislature and nearly so in another for Democrats, and obviously the gains in the congressional delegation were significant. But it was a blue wave year. I think Nevada was the shining example of that blue wave. It was as big of a wave as you could expect, but that can shift back. You can find another Republican gubernatorial nominee like Brian Sandoval who will really appeal to moderates, who can campaign effectively in the state in a way that some of the statewide candidates were just unable to do this year. And while I think there is a lot of evidence that Nevada is bluer today than it was 10 years ago, it's still a state with an independent streak. It's still a state where a lot of voters are just looking for a candidate with the right ideas and not necessarily the candidate with the right letter after his or her name. And so I think for the Democratic Party, if I were advising the Democratic Party in Nevada, and I'm not, I would say don't take anything for granted. This is not a blue state. This is going to be a swing state in 2020. It's going to be a state with competitive congressional and senatorial elections into the next several cycles, and it's one in which we know Republicans can win statewide, and there's a roadmap for how to do that effectively.
What is the status of Yucca under the new Congress?
You know, Yucca is something that's so critically important to this state. I think there are a lot of people who understand the issue in a sort of veiled way, and there are people who really understand what something like restarting the nuclear waste disposal site at Yucca Mountain would mean for things like tourism, for security, et cetera. And in the last Congress, there was movement to restart this project, to get the funding moving forward, and that legislation received quite a bit of support in the US House. It failed to come to a vote in the US Senate, in large part because Leader McConnell was protecting Dean Heller. And there was worry that in the lame duck, after Heller lost, that they might rush this legislation through. Now, the Congress adjourned at the beginning of January, and that legislation died. So in order for that to get rehabilitated, the House would have to vote again, the Senate would have to vote, and then the president would have to sign it. And so thinking about the politics of this is actually pretty interesting. So you have a president who's up for re-election in 2020, who might have on his desk, though I don't think he will have this on his desk, and I'll explain why in a minute, might have on his desk a piece of legislation that says, let's ship a ton of nuclear waste to a swing state in an election that's going to be extremely competitive for you. If I were advising the president, and I'm not, I would say veto that. Absolutely veto it. But it's more complex than that. There was one person casting a vote on the House-passed legislation in 2018 on this issue that was the most important vote there was, and that was Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi, as the Democratic leader, voted no on that legislation. As Speaker of the House, she has almost absolute control over what comes up for a vote in the House, and Nancy Pelosi has no interest in doing something that damages the Democratic brand in this state, that hurts freshmen of Democratic congresspeople and 2 new Democratic senators as well. There is probably, and I would say not probably, if you look at the vote from 2018, there is majority support for this legislation in the US House, and there is certainly majority support for this legislation in the US Senate. Right now, Nevada's best friend, if you are interested in stopping Yucca, is Nancy Pelosi, and I think she'll stand pretty firm for fear of what kind of retribution that can mean for her party as the national leader of that party right now.
So what are the chances for a major infrastructure bill given, where Congress is?
So I think when you look out at the current Congress, you think this is a Congress that can't get anything done. And that movie has been on repeat for several Congresses recently. But we'll know more about the prospects for an infrastructure bill based on what happens in terms of ending this government shutdown. Can the president and the House Speaker play nice? Can the president come out of this government shutdown by putting together a legislative package around immigration in which he comes out looking more positively, where he gets credit for the changes in legislation with regard to immigration? If he sees benefits from working with Speaker Pelosi, he is going to be more interested in working with Speaker Pelosi in the future. And the one thing the president has said that is a Democratic priority that he supports is a serious and big, huge, you might say, infrastructure bill. This is something that he sees as a job creator, which it is, a revenue generator, which it is. It is also unique for this president because he is a Republican a Republican president who really doesn't mind deficit spending. And an infrastructure bill will be serious deficit spending. And I think if he looks out at the first 2 years of his presidency and he sees the big piece of legislation that passed was a Republican-led tax bill, and he got no credit for it. And in fact, there's some evidence that he lost support because of the passage of the tax bill. And I think the tax bill had a lot to do with why Republicans did as poorly as they did in the midterm elections. If he's such a transactional guy, he's going to look at that and say, I took the Republican lead and it didn't help me, but I worked together with a Democrat on reopening the government and it did help me, if it does. The next transaction, he's going to want to win. And I think winning for him could be infrastructure. It's going to hurt him with Laura Ingraham. It's going to hurt him with Sean Hannity. And so is an immigration deal, too. But if he sees those poll numbers tick up, if Americans start to look at the president and say, hey, this is a guy who can actually work across the aisle, He didn't really need to in the first 2 years of his presidency. That is going to, I think, motivate him to continue to work. And an infrastructure bill would mean a lot to a lot of states, but it would mean a lot to swing states like this one. My research shows that presidents act a lot like members of Congress. They're re-election-minded individuals, and they steer federal funding to swing states, and that behavior really ramps up in the 2 years before an election year. There is no better way to steer federal funding in the ways that you want to, and to the states that you want to, than having a massive stimulus package in the form of an infrastructure bill. I think it's something that would be important for America, but specifically, I think it's something that would be significant for a state like Nevada as well.
Okay, one last question. Our new governor wants to set up a cannabis council. Do you think that's a good idea?
You know, I do. Whether you love or hate cannabis, whether you don't care about cannabis, it's policy that's here to stay in the state. It's a revenue generator for this state. It is something that affects both residents and tourists. And while Nevada is one of, I would say, the shining examples of states that can get this done pretty well, there are still problems in the system. There are still issues that exist, whether they were issues in the licensing process, which Governor Sisolak talked about the other night at the Smith Center, or whether it is looking down the road at the types of challenges or the types of issues that the state needs to face, like social consumption lounges, for instance. This is something that is, I think, viewed by many as a minor part of public policy. Obviously, education, transportation, a lot of the issues that Rob is going to talk about in a moment are much bigger and more important items to the average Nevadan. But if this system goes awry, if legal cannabis in the state begins to create public health or public safety problems, it will increase in its importance in a negative way to the average Nevadan. So the best thing that the governor can do, the best thing that the legislature can do, and the best thing for local officials is to get on board for a cannabis commission that is balanced, that is looking at issues in a holistic way, that engages law enforcement and engages industry and engages educators and every other part of this state's society that is touched by this issue in some way or could be touched by this issue in some way. That is why, excuse me, I would endorse this commission so long as it's structured properly and it has the right jurisdiction and the right lead to do what's right. But like I said, it is effective as Nevada has been at implementing adult use cannabis, particularly compared to some other states in the West. There's more that needs to be done, and they shouldn't see this as a perfect system.
All right, one more question,
Sure.
And this is it. What does it mean for Nevada to have a supermajority of Democrats in the Assembly? What does it mean in general for a state in terms of a dynamic to have a party so in control of an Assembly or a Senate?
You know, with a Democratic governor, it doesn't mean much. I don't see the legislature overriding Governor Sisolak that often. But what it does show is that there is a broad base of legislators who are there to work closely with the governor. I think while obviously policy in the state is going to be moving further to the left than it has been for quite some time, the reality is that the negotiations between a legislature and a governor, or just the information flow between a legislature and a governor, is oftentimes more effective when it is from the same party. And while divided government certainly has its benefits in some contexts, putting the brakes on policy that might be moving too quickly, the last thing that you want is a legislature and a governor who don't talk to each other. You're not going to have that in this state. You've had periods of that during the Sandoval administration, and that was problematic on a variety of issues. But moving forward, I think making sure that state legislators recognize the sort of special role that they have, particularly in historic terms for Nevada, is one in which it will ensure that a governor is not just accountable to the people who elected him governor, but accountable to the individual issues that exist in state house and state senate districts as well, which are many. And I think for a place like Clark County in particular, making sure that that information flow is going up to the governor's mansion as frequently and as soundly as possible is an important opportunity that the state and this county will have.
Okay, thanks very much, John. So I'm going to stand now, and please load my PowerPoint, because you don't get enough PowerPoints, I know. You all love PowerPoint so much, so here's another one for you. I want to talk today, and briefly, about Southern Nevada's opportunities to 2030, and the reason I want to do that is that in previous versions of this event, I've presented the Brookings ideas, going through this decade. What are some of the key goals? I compared us to cities like Omaha, but most especially to Orlando, because it's our closest peer, because it's dominated by tourism as we are. And they had certain assets that we didn't have, and I thought we needed to go after some of those assets. And I'm happy to report, as you'll see, most of those assets are now in place, which is surprising because we were a little ways into the decade when we suggested these ideas, and we're not quite to the end of the decade right now, and yet they're all mostly in place. But as I start here, let me just say, first, a disclaimer. If you don't like what I'm saying, do not yell at UNLV. I'm a college professor. See, those guys are college professors, like Kingsfield over there in the paper chase. That guy was scary, by the way. And the dude in Animal House, Donald Sutherland. We're supposed to be controversial. The better the school, the more controversy. You know how you know you have a R1 school? When the college professors are spouting off all the time. Because that's when you've got a kind of research university where you have the freedom to imagine that somebody could, have an idea independent of the, the leadership, and tell hard truths to the state if necessary. So to begin, I want to look at the 5 goals that we proposed for 2020, and we're almost there. And then I want to talk about the goals going forward to 2030. And the reason you see the little oranges there is that's a cover from a Business Voice. They did a great job of summarizing in 2014 those 5 stated goals. And the reason it's orange is we were compared to Orlando at that point. So what were the goals? 1, establish a UNLV med school by the end of this decade. We got it started by 2017, a little ahead of schedule. We don't have a building yet, and we need to get one. Get us to R1 status, that is the university that you're in right now, UNLV. That happened so ahead of schedule. There was one regent, Rick Trachok, that said, it could be 2030 when UNLV gets there, or beyond, literally. I mean, Rick, give us a break, would you? That's a regent, by the way. Of course, UNR was going to get there first, which it didn't. We got there at the same time, or maybe we got there a day early. We're not really quite sure what happened with that. We know we were in before they were. We don't know. They added 10 more schools. The next thing you know, they're in. But bottom line, we're in, and that's all that matters. Upgrade our tourist infrastructure. The stadium, as you know, is under construction. The convention center is expanding. That was a direct comparison with Orlando. By the way, one of the other assets was, at that point, we didn't even have a new hotel college building. We had punted on that during the recession. And Orlando had gotten that done with a similar, grant for $25 million. Interstate 11, thank you, Harry Reid. It was really the last earmark from Congress. Got our share done to the Arizona border. We can't build beyond that. We're not responsible for another state. Arizona is. Good news. They're working on it. And then the only thing that we don't have going in the ground right now was light rail. And we had suggested that, although there's a Maryland Parkway study underway, and it looks promising. And I'll get to more of that later. So what do we compare now? Well, obviously, all the big regions in the Intermountain West are essentially our comparative regions. Phoenix is especially important because it's larger than us, and it's 20 or 30 years ahead of us in some ways. I'd say it's behind us in other ways. But it's a great example of what it looks like to be a bigger metropolitan area and what asset mix you'd have at that point. So my gang went down to Phoenix most recently. We're going to get out a brief in the next couple of weeks where we're learning from Phoenix, and you'll see some of the evidence of that in this talk right now. Going forward, we want to look at places like Barcelona for trade shows. We want to look at Milan for arts and entertainment and design. The sort of southern tier of Europe is comparable to us. I'd call it the European Sun Belt or the Mediterranean. And there's a lot we can learn from those places as well. And going forward, we're going to be doing that. So starting with just ASU versus UNLV, what's cool is ASU has tons and tons of metrics that they use to determine where their university is, how things are going, how they compare to other major universities, other research universities. And what's nice is they came up with this little typology here, this little categorization scheme. So they came up with this model where there's academic schools like Harvard, there's state-controlled schools like UNLV, which we're in. Then there's the University of Phoenix, which is a for-profit proprietary school. And then finally, they believe their model is an enterprise model where, despite the fact that they're ostensibly led by a state, they're so independent of that state that they're able to create all this opportunity to partnership and innovation. And they are the leading innovation university in the United States, according to US News and World Report. So for us, a good goal would be, we're now in the top 120 institutions, or 130 when they added the other 10. What we'd like to do by the next 10 years is get us maybe into the top 60. Now, that's not a bad goal, because when you look at Salt Lake and you look at Denver and you look at Phoenix, they're in the top 30. They have institutions in the top 30, top 40. So to be in the top 60 is not that high an aspiration, but from where we started, it's important. We're the 10th youngest school out of the 130 that's in R1. So there's only about 15 schools in that category founded post-World War II, and we're one of them. And in some cases, we're newer because, unlike University of California, San Diego, we weren't spun off some enormous enterprise and successful enterprise like University of California, and we didn't have something in place like Scripps before they remade us into the University of California, San Diego. So what we really need to do is start with working big time on graduate education. That's what got us to this game. The number of doctoral production numbers that came out of this school, the number of people produced with terminal degrees, is what helped lift us in the Carnegie standing. And we need to keep doing that. And let me tell you just 2 seconds on this, how important graduate education is. Amazon recently did a headquarters. They picked New York and they picked Arlington, Virginia. The Arlington deal was driven, and they say this, because Virginia Tech, my old school where I taught before I was here, at my old campus in Northern Virginia, did a deal for a $1 billion graduate only. Yes, graduate. And she's got all these metrics out there you see. Not one of them has to do with graduate education. They don't even categorize it. They don't even care about it. That's what got us to R1. There are real states out there like Virginia, big grown-up states, and they're sitting there doing deals with Amazon and putting together packages where they do graduate-only universities. I would know. I was on that campus, and the students I left behind were some of the people that negotiated it. We need to up our graduate numbers. They got 20,000 graduate students at Arizona State University. We have 5,000 now. At 2.2 million people, right now, we have 5. At 3 million, we should at least have 10 going forward, because we're not static. We're still growing, obviously. So graduate education is important. Without it, Amazon looks at you like you're just going to be a branch office. You're not in a leadership position. You're not going to be qualified for a headquarters function. And what we should also do, and we did this already, the idea for the MGM partnership with UNLV came from Brookings, came from my colleague Bill Brown, because we stole it from ASU, which did it with Starbucks. And of course, ASU was allowed to do it alone with Starbucks. They didn't have to go through the whole system office to do it. There is no system office. There's 7 people working at the system office in Arizona, believe it or not. So they don't actually have to worry about that. We had to go through the system office. UNLV could have done that on its own. It would have been perfectly fine. That was our idea in the first place. We also need, for goal 2, and Jeremy Aguero and I were talking backstage, and he mentioned this on stage, we have a plan dating to the 1960s when the state had 3 people living in it, and they were all living in Elko, all right? Yeah, that's not a good idea. And the current system we have actually strips wealth out of southern Nevada and redistributes it around the state. 2/3 of our land taxes, for example, are swept immediately out of our, we pay it to the county, and they're taken right out and put into a collective fund and redistributed. And you see that not CCSD, but State of Nevada schools at Clark County. That's how my shop refers to our schools, because that's what they are. Our schools are run by the state. For example, there was a school strike in LA, and it was all about the mayor. It's never about the county commissioner here. They got nothing to do with it. It's administered from the state. The superintendent reports to the state. Steve Sisolak, our new governor, was the head of county commission. While he was the county commissioner here, he had less to do with our schools than he does as governor. That is weird. We got a big metropolitan area here. We can manage the largest tourist economy in the United States, a globally exporting tourist economy. We can't manage our schools, and we can't tax ourselves out of our land taxes, the most fundamental, most elemental local form of taxation, and keep that resource and spend it. The whole strip is collectivized and redistributed everywhere. That's an asset that exists in this county. You think in Fairfax County, Virginia, where I used to live? You think all of Tyson's Corner, all that's all shared with the state of Virginia? You think they go down to Richmond and ask them to run their schools? You think somebody in Richmond, Virginia is running the schools in Fairfax County, Virginia? Let me tell you, that wouldn't happen in Virginia. That shouldn't happen in Nevada. We need to change that. We need to get that done by 2030. Because what's happening? We're practically at the bottom in education. Now, the interesting thing here is, it doesn't surprise me that we're weak in K through 12 education, because we actually spend about dead last in K through 12 education. So when you see these numbers about the number of high school graduates, and remember, these numbers are volatile because there's immigration to the state. And fortunately for us, like Blanche Dubois, who lives on the kindness of strangers, we benefit because we have immigrants that are coming with higher credentials than we do. If it wasn't for those immigrants, you can't believe what our graduate credentials would look like, because we so underproduce that credential relative to the amount of demand that we see in a region of ours that's emerging in areas like business services, healthcare, fields that really do require terminal degrees or advanced credentialing. So at this point, we're okay on high school a little. We have a lot of associate degrees and people who've partly completed because they haven't completed a 4-year degree. And then on the rest of it, we're kind of weak. And here's the kicker. We spend well on higher education. We're actually 17th per student in higher education. But our results are surprisingly weak relative to that. I would argue that's the structure of governance. What we need to do is get that ASU structure, where ASU gets to do its thing, as universities typically do. Virginia Tech, when they did the deal with Amazon, they weren't going down to the state higher education office and asking, is it okay if we could do a deal with Amazon? They just did a deal with Amazon, because that's what universities do, because universities are supposed to be in charge. True economic diversification. What that means is, in the early part of this decade, 2011, Brookings did the State Economic Development Plan, which the governor then adopted, and was the basis for GoEd, and was the basis for the strategic plan that they used going forward. Now, that plan worked. It worked actually better in Reno than Las Vegas. And just to give you a sense of the difference, we, most recently, regional numbers came out in terms of income, how much we grew or how much Reno grew in terms of wealth per household. And in those numbers, Washoe County went up $4,600 from the period in the late part of the last decade to the late part of this decade. Quite substantial. We went up $700. They went up $4,600. Here's why. 3/4 of what the state, plus actually 77% of what the state invested to induce businesses to move here through tax incentives, went to the north. One county got 2/3, Washoe County. One county got 2/3, Story County, 4,000 people, 90% white. Our county, 2.2 million people, majority minority, got 22.5% of that resource. Now, the vast majority of that wealth is generated down here because the taxation that would allow you to forgive a company entering our state and provide a cushion for them as an inducement for them to locate here comes out of our highly productive resort industry. Yet this money wasn't spent anywhere near those resorts. It was spent hundreds of miles away and invested in one particular region that has seen enormous gains from this. What I'd say over this decade, if it's okay, could we maybe focus on Las Vegas for a little while? Would that be all right? Because it's about time, all right? And what we need to do is, and we started this process, Faraday Futures didn't work out, but what worked out is that it got Apex moving, and that's a big benefit for us, because Apex is going to be the site by which, if you ever do a major deal of the type that Tesla was, and Tesla originally looked at Apex, it would be good to have that as ready for development, as good to go as possible. And as shovel-ready as we can make it right now, which is that the infrastructure is falling in place to put it on a competitive setting as the largest place in the southern Nevada economy where you can do, outside of the resort industry, large projects. So also, though, never forget where we came from, and Jeremy reminds you, and so does Steve Hill, that the heart of this region will remain through 2030, through the middle of this century into perhaps the end of the century, the tourist sector itself. And we're successful now in terms of events and sports. We've built that out. That was one of the strong suggestions. We looked at Orlando and said Orlando's really succeeding in this way. I mean, they're doing the Pro Bowl this weekend, for example. That's something we'll get now that we've got an arena for it. They had those assets, we didn't. The other thing, and this is always important to remember about Las Vegas, and this is what's different than Phoenix. The good news for Las Vegas is that we're not just the center of tourism that happens here. We export the management of tourism around the country. We're like Texas with oil. So Texas with oil is, yeah, they got oil, and they learned how to drill for oil, and they learned how to finance drilling for oil, and they learned how to process oil and transport oil, and they learned all that stuff. And then they shipped that knowledge all around the world, headquartered out of cities in Texas, like Dallas or Houston. What we have is we do the same thing. Our firms grew so large and so successful and with such sophistication that they overwhelm firms in other parts of the world in regard to how they manage tourism. And we have wealth coming back to us by that management. So we have 6 Fortune 1000 firms, all in gaming or gaming tech, that are the leaders in the field in terms of this export market. And as a result, we're much wealthier for that. And we need to sustain that. And to sustain that, the competitive advantage there requires some of the other inputs like education, some of the other inputs like infrastructure that we've been promoting in the past. And finally, we don't have any form of serious mass transit in the city. Now, the Strip is by far the largest, densest, biggest product in the United States without mass transit. Now, the old way, when I used to say this, the case that was more accurate was, Wilshire Boulevard, which is the main spine of commerce that runs from the center of Los Angeles to the west side to Santa Monica at the ocean. That was the densest corridor in the United States that was not served by any form of rail, light rail, or anything else. What they're doing there now, I don't know if any of you have noticed, if you've ever been on Wilshire Boulevard lately, look out. They're tearing the whole thing apart. Why? They're building a subway under it. Wilshire isn't getting light rail, it's getting heavy rail. It's getting a subway. So now what we have is by far, we're talking 40, 50-story buildings. Where else in the United States do you go where there are skyscrapers that you see like this and look up and can't see the top practically? Well, you don't have rail combined with it. I was in Phoenix last week, and they got rail going down the Central Ave corridor. And those buildings are like this high, and they've got rail going down there. So we're going to need to do that. We could start along Maryland Parkway. I guess everybody just needs to see it work in some place first. It would be really good to have it for the university the way ASU has it. It would connect us to the downtown medical campus that we're going to build. But it's a big win for everybody. It's not just a big win for the university. It's a big win for tourists, for commuters, and for everyone. So just to wrap up, UNLV, top 60. New funding formula for CCSD, true economic diversification, meaning that we get a share of the new economy, technology. I mean, I didn't say this when I was on that slide, but we have this one metaphor that I'd like to just mention here. We have this world-class robotics lab. It's in a 99-cent store out on Flamingo. It's not actually in the 99-cent store. It's in the back of the 99-cent store. And the 99-cent store isn't selling little robotic things like little drones or something like that. The front of it's just the 99-cent store. And the back of it is our leading robotics lab, where the National Science Foundation is sending us grants. And one of the products was that arm for that little girl who's thrown out all those pitches in Major League Baseball. And they're on their 7th engineering building at UNR, as a matter of fact. And we have one engineering building and a robotics lab in the back of a 99-cent store. And our 2 programs aren't that dissimilar in size, and they're not dissimilar at all in national ranking. And we have great prospects for that program. But we're going to need to have some resources invested in us. And the Vegas build-out, we cannot dial back at all in terms of the momentum that we've gotten in events, conventions, sports, being the leading venue. At the same time, we have to be mindful of the fact that this business environment has to be conducive to headquarter functions, because that is actually the real bread and butter, which is that we're in a command and control position. I'd rather be us than Orlando in that regard. Orlando is a branch of LA. The biggest companies in Orlando are Disney and Universal. Gee, I wonder where they're headquartered. Phoenix has, 4.7 million people, some golf courses, some branches of companies. What's a major firm you can think of is located in Phoenix? We're in a unique position. We run our lives because we have our headquarters. And then finally, to be taken seriously at this point, we're about to open this giant stadium. We don't have any mass transit in place. I'm guessing there'll be a few galactic tie-ups on the Strip. And somehow we'll find the will. It's almost like a kind of shock to the system. It's going to almost take something where it makes the national news that somebody actually showed up in Vegas and couldn't leave the airport for 2 days and took up residence there. And they, yes, Bob, I was there and I never got out of the airport because the city is crazy. What's going on? Then we'll probably get something. All right. And just finally, I think these goals are reasonable. I don't think they're, a stretch. We're making a lot of progress on them already. And our peers have gotten to a lot of these goals. And our peers now include the Phoenixes and the Denvers. And going forward, I think we really have to start thinking of the global position of this city and look to some global leaders in areas where, we're smug and complacent because we're doing U.S. comparative analysis. And in relative terms to the cities that we compare ourselves to, we're privileged. But in reality, we're in a global community, and that includes Asian and European cities. And I think especially relevant here is that there's a lot we can learn from Barcelona and Milan. And it's no joke, I'll end on this note. I came here, and one of the first things I said, because my last university had a partnership with the Milan Polytechnic, and I spent a lot of time in Milan, that the fashion industry in Milan is not unlike some of the furniture stuff we do at that giant furniture mart, by downtown, and that we could develop an actual Las Vegas style in art and architecture. And I think we've got the makings of that. And that is an amazing, high-tiered place to be as a regional economy, because it's very well-paying jobs, it's important, it's globally influential, it's great for branding. And that Barcelona, as a leading trade show city, does trade shows slightly differently than we do. And it would be worth our time to put some staff and folks in communication with those guys and figure out, what is the special formula in Europe, because there are these kinds of, events they do in Europe. We do these grand scale events, but some of the events in Europe are really, kind of an interesting twist and variation. And, to the extent that we can gain competitive advantage, and it was mentioned, all these other places are building convention centers. So let's stay on the stick and let's get moving to 2030. Thanks very much. Bye.